Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of In Talks with JD. And wow, what an episode it's going to be. I'm delighted and honoured to be joined by the wonderful, recently appointed CEO of Amy, Stephanie Charman. In this episode, we're going to explore Stephanie's thoughts on the market and AMI's plans to support our mortgage intermediary world. Stay tuned, not one you want to miss. Thank you for joining me today on the purple sofa. So, recently appointed CEO of Amy. Before we kind of come into a little bit more information about that, tell me about your recent event. And I think we've got a picture of you on stage coming up now. How did it feel?
So thank you for having me on having me here. I'm delighted to be on the purple sofa, John. So last week, my first Amy dinner as CEO, and wow, what an event! So hopefully that echoes. To stand up in front of all of those people and deliver that sort of inaugural speech around, really focused on the role that Amy's playing, and really touching into the mortgage rule review, and both myself and our board chair Andrew Montlake really touched into that in a lot of detail, but we felt it was the right thing to do, and I'm sure we will touch into it today as well. But absolutely amazing event, completely overwhelmed, and a great sense of pride in the team of what we delivered.
Cool, fantastic. So for the benefit of those watching that may not be that familiar with Amy's role, can you give us a little bit of a brief description?
Yeah, so Amy's role is to be the voice, a collective voice of the advisor. So we're a regulatory lobbying trade body whose purpose is to monitor, review, feedback on legislative changes, regulatory papers, consultation papers, etc., and work alongside, fostering relationships with other trade bodies, lenders, providers, and most importantly, our members, and representing their needs. And I think what does that mean in practice, really? Because that sounds very sort of high level, doesn't it? I have a fantastic team. We have a fantastic team at Amy of policy experts who will digest those consultation papers, break it down into what does this mean for the industry, what does it mean for our member firms, and we'll obviously respond back where appropriate. But also when those policy statements come out, it's about that practical guidance of things you need to consider to actually maybe implement into your business. And consumer duty was a really good example of that, around how do we take that regulatory change and then digest it into bite-sized pieces with practical help and support for our member firms.
Okay, so as I've said, recently into the role, what drew you to it?
So I've worked closely with Amy for a long time across different initiatives, and I've known Robert for a number of years. Can't go without mentioning.
Oh no, absolutely not.
My fantastic predecessor,
absolutely
Robert. So obviously when he announced his retirement, I mean, what a fantastic role to step into. I think for me, I'm passionate about advice, and I hope that resonates and that comes through. Passionate about advice, passionate about the role that advisors play. And I suppose it was the opportunity to step in and maybe, hopefully, make some meaningful change into the industry.
Cool. So what is your vision then? So obviously we've mentioned Robert, but what is your vision over the next 3 to 5 years?
So I think there is an element of my vision will adapt and change and pivot depending on, what do our member needs. But I think, we are entering quite a pivotal time for change, I think, in the industry. We've got, I'm sure we'll touch into technology at some point and AI. What conversations doesn't get a touch of AI mentioned. So we'll touch into that. But I think, we have got the advent of AI. We've got, we've got a growth agenda from the government that's feeding down into the regulator and feeding down into us. And market conditions are difficult. So how does Amy play a role in all of that? And I think that vision and us continuing to have that voice is really pinnacle. So for me, it's how do we continue to be the strong collective voice that we are today, in amongst all of that changing landscape.
Okay, and have you got any kind of key priorities?
Yes, so probably not quite the priorities I had when I walked in through the door on the 24th of February.
Okay.
And that is down to probably the mortgage rule review that's come out. So we've got a very active regulator at the moment. As I said, that just touched on that focus from a government on home ownership and how home ownership will, we know that there's a real strong link between home ownership and economic growth, which is great. And, we all want that. But, not at the detriment of advice. So that's just, the whole of May, the team, myself, the board, have spent a huge amount of time making sure our response to the mortgage rule review consultations, the CP 2511.
Okay.
For anybody who doesn't know,
CP 2511.
2511 ingrained in my brain.
Yeah.
And we've spent a huge amount of time making sure our response to that was thorough. So the crux of CP 2511, if I can just don't mind me taking a moment.
Yeah, of course, it's so important.
And it is important, there's sort of three areas within it. A couple of things more touched into from a lender perspective, so modified affordability and no affordability checks on term reductions. In the main we're fairly comfortable with those. Let's just park those for the moment. The biggest piece is the removal of the advice interaction trigger, and this leads us to a place where execution only sales could be more prevalent, so potentially taking away advice, and that to us just doesn't stand. 90% of customers choose intermediary advice, about circa 90%, and overall advice accounts for about 97% of mortgage sales. In our minds, that's a tick, that's a positive, that's meeting consumer duty obligations. Why would we want to step away from that? So though we totally stand, are in agreement for simplifying any approaches, it shouldn't be at the detriment of advice. And so we've spent a huge amount of time responding to that, and our response can be found on the AMI website if anybody would love to read that in real detail.
Okay.
And I encourage members to do that.
Yeah, okay. It still surprises me that the execution only piece, it's mad.
It is mad.
Okay, so just want to move now on to the diversity and inclusion charter that you've linked up with IMLA on. So what is the goal? What are we trying to achieve with this?
Yeah, so it's probably worth just stepping back slightly.
Okay.
So working in mortgages has been a really successful initiative. It's something that I was involved in prior to joining AMI, and has always been in collaboration with IMLA, perhaps a little bit more loosely than it is that it's going to be going forward. Okay. And working in mortgages alongside IMLA, alongside initiatives such as DIF, which is run by AE3, has all been there to raise the awareness of ED&I, and it's really important, and we've come a really long way in a very short period of time, but there's so much more that we can do. And as I stepped into role, we did a complete reset of working in mortgages. So we brought everybody to, those key stakeholders that have been involved. And as I said on Thursday night, the volunteers, and people do volunteer their time across the advice community and lenders and providers into working in mortgages. We celebrated the success, so we should recognise all the success we've had. But we've also said, right, what do we need to do? What perhaps hasn't worked quite so well, and what do we need to do in the future? And that brought us to having a shared purpose, a new shared purpose, which is to make the industry a fairer and more accessible place to work and to do business with. So it's two core pillars. It's how do we attract people into this industry, and I'm incredibly passionate about, as you've heard me talk around, incredibly passionate about how do we get new people in. But also when people join this industry, how do we make sure that they can navigate through a career path in a safe way to do that? And I think that's really important. So what we've done is we've brought IMLA and AMI even closer together. So we now have Nicola Goldie from Aldermore as chair of Working in Mortgages, and Dom Scott as deputy chair. So we've got AMI and IMLA leads there at the top. Amy and myself are still there as part of that steering working group, and we're working through, well, what's next? What makes meaningful change? And we'll continue to have working groups working on lots of smaller pieces of work, but we're just working at the moment on that key strategic objective, John. So if I'm allowed to be invited back, I would love to come back in the future and talk about that in a bit more detail. But we're just working through what does that really sort of focus on, and how do we, as I said, make impactful change with working in mortgages going forward.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's so important, for firms like us attracting new people to our industry. We need it. We need it.
We do, and it's a fantastic place to industry to work within, and I just don't think we shout loud enough around the roles that advisors do, the real purpose of the role that you do, and how you help customers. I would never have known about that role when I left school, and do other people, and having spent some time with some Gen Z, they don't know. So how do we make them aware?
Cool, fantastic. So last question, if you could achieve one thing during your time as CEO, what would it be?
So I think at this moment in time, I think it's to ensure that the value of advice and the pivotal role advisors play remains just front and centre. So I think that can, at this moment in time, that can be my only one objective, I think, is to ensure that it remains as is, for the benefit of customers.
And I think everyone watching this will agree that they really want to remain front and centre, any brokers. So that brings to a close part one. And it's great to hear such proactive plans from Amy to support our intermediary market, a market we all love and cherish. So join me in part two, where we're going to be focusing on the outlook of the market. And we're going to be talking about the new 100% mortgage, not one you want to miss.